Welcome to section 0.2, adding and subtracting fractions. Now, since we already talked about multiplying and dividing fractions, we're going to be using that in this section. But we also need to talk about what are common denominators and examples of adding and subtracting. Now, common denominators are a critical concept to understand if we're going to be successful in adding and subtracting fractions. So you really need to understand what this is, not just for this section, but it will help you throughout Math 9 and even into 101 considerably. So let's just get some terminology. Common denominator. Well, we know denominators at the bottom are the numbers on bottom, and the common mean they have to be the same. So the common denominator, if they're not already the same, is just a number that is a multiple of every denominator. So if I have numbers like, let's say, 3 and 5, I'm saying 3 times what is going to equal 5 times something. I'm just trying to find, now this is a combination thing, so it's a little bit trickier than it may seem. And I'll show you exactly how to do that. Now, the lowest common denominator, the least common denominator, also known as LCD, that's how we abbreviate it, is, well, the smallest, since least is smallest. So it's just we're trying to find the smallest common denominator. You don't have to use the smallest common denominator whenever you're combining fractions, you're adding and subtracting them, but it does make the process simpler, and it helps you not have to do as much reduction at the end of the process. So how do you find the lowest common denominator? Well, let's just do an example and I'll help explain it. So here, I want to find the lowest common denominator of these two fractions, 5/8 and 7/12. So you can ask yourself, what do they have in common? Well, first off, I don't care about the numerators. I'm just looking at the bottom, 8 and 12. And like I said before, we could just multiply the denominators together and they'll give us a common denominator. But that may not be the least one. To find the least, there's a lot of ways that you can go about this. You could just plug in numbers and test and try to find 8, 16, go through the list of multiples of 8, multiples of 12, and see what overlap. And that would work, but sometimes that can be extremely cumbersome. So instead, I'm going to teach you a different method known as the factoring method. It's sometimes how it's referred to. So you take 8, for instance, one of the denominators, and I want you to think for a moment, how could you factor that? We've already done some factoring, so we're going to break it up into numbers that multiply together to give me 8. I want you to pause the video and factor 8. Go ahead. Okay, so if you did that, you should have gotten 2 times 2 times 2. So what about 12? Can you factor 12? Go ahead. Well, again, if you factor this, it turns into 2 times 2 times 3. So now that we've factored these, we're now going to find the lowest common denominator. We're going to say, what do they have in common? Well, they both have a 2, and then they have another 2, so they have two 2's. So I can just write 2 times 2 since that's what they have in common, because since they both have it in common, it just automatically comes down. Now notice the 3 and this 2 have nothing left in common, so the question is what's left? Well, this is a 2, and this is a 3, so if you multiply those together, you get 2 times 3. Multiply all of that together, so we've now used this 2, this 2, and this 2. Those 2's are also taken at the same time as those. This 3 is being used. Multiply them together and you get 24. That's a whole lot smaller number to work with than 8 times 12, which is 96. So this made it a little bit simpler by just multiplying them all together and seeing how they overlap with each other. Okay, so let's try it again. This time I have 3/5 and 1/2. So again, the only thing I need to focus on is my denominator, 5 and 2. So 5, how could you factor 5? Well, remember, we're talking about numbers that go into it, and only 5 goes into it. It's a prime number. And 2 is the same sort of scenario. Both of them are prime numbers. So when we're doing the lowest common denominator, what do they have in common? Well, they have nothing in common, which means we just get to put everything, the 2 and the 5, in there together. So this idea of lowest common denominator is just about seeing what they have in common. That already gets in, and then everything else gets just stuck in at the end. So what about this one? So which is 10, sorry. What about the next one, 10 and 14? I want you to pause the video and I want you to find the lowest common denominator for 3/10 and 5/14. Go ahead. Okay, well, factoring 10, if you factor that, that's 2 and 5, and 14, you get 2 and 7. If you didn't factor them and you got lost, okay, I want you to pause the video and finish finding the common denominator by looking for things in common. If you did already do that, let's go ahead and go on. Well, they both have a 2 in common, so lowest common denominator gets a 2, and I can cross that out. Now what's left over? Well, a 5 and a 7, they have nothing in common, so they each get to come down here. I have 2 times 5 times 7, which is 70. It's pretty nice if you ask, a pretty simple process. This will also help us out in just a little bit, but let's try another one. What if I do 3 fractions, 1/6, 2/9, and 7/45? So I want you to pause the video and try doing the same thing, but with 3 numbers. Go ahead. Okay, 3 numbers a little tricky, but we can start off the same way. Can you factor all 3 of the denominators? 6, 9, and 45. 6, how does that factor? Factors into 2 times 3. What about 9? How does that factor? 3 times 3. And 45, you can break that up into 3 times 3 times 5. So this is how all 3 numbers factor. So lowest common denominator, remember, what are we looking for? What do they have in common? So what do all 3 of these have in common? They all have a 3. 3, 3, 3. So if I take those 3s, notice I crossed out the ones that are used. They're all used. There's that. Now, I have a 2 here. That has nothing in common with anything down here, but I can come back to this. When you have 3s, you start off by saying, what do all 3 have in common? And then you start saying, what do any of the pairs have in common? So I can take this 2 and say, does that have anything in common with 3? No. Does 2 have anything in common with 3 and 5? No. Does 3 and 5 have anything in common? Yes. This 3 and that 3 are common, so I can write that as a 3. Now all that's left is this 5 and that 2, which have nothing in common. And a 2 and a 5 just get to come down on the end. If you multiply all this together, you'll end up with 90. So this process of factoring, finding things in common, and so forth will help us find the lowest common denominator more smoothly than probably any other way. All right, please continue the video as we go through examples as to how to add and subtract fractions, and we'll be using this common denominators.